Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Quantum Mystic Podcast. I'm Jane Bear, and of course, my lovely co host, Lisa Campion. We're here today. We're going to talk a little bit about, maybe even a lot of it, about grief and how grief work is really an important and integral process of the spiritual path. Um, Lisa, do you want to start? You have anything to
Yeah,
say? I'm sure
I
we have a
think
lot
it's
to
so
say.
important. Oh my
Yeah.
God, yeah, we have so much to say about this topic, but I think it's like grief is, and especially for us Western or our Western culture, it's just so weird about grief. Like we're really um we just have some very strange denial and we don't really want to talk about it and we don't really want to look at it and we don't know what to say when people are grieving and we don't know how to process grief. I think it feels like we have this sort of like 6 week period. Let's say somebody passes away, or there's some loss that you're dealing with that we have this sort of 6 week period where you get casseroles and Hallmark cards and I'm sorry for your loss. And then somehow it's like we move on and we don't ever talk about it again, and it's just such a strange um way of handling it that feels very um I don't know, contrary to how the natural grief process really goes. So I think understanding how the natural grief process goes, how grief is really different for everybody, how long it takes to process grief, and so we can. I guess the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is we do a lot to avoid it
Mm,
and avoid talking about it, avoid thinking about it, avoid people that are going through it,
mhm.
and that is hard because we live in a temporary world. We live in a world where, things are changing, people die, things end, and that is just the nature of life on earth. That's something we can't get away from. What is it they say? Like the only two things you can count on are death and taxes,
Mhm. Mhm.
and we just are like somehow short circuit when it comes to loss and grief and death.
Yeah, totally. It's all really good points, and it's like we I think everybody feels like this heavy burden of grief,
Mhm.
and whether it's personal grief, it could be in our own life that something is happening, a change is happening, or we've lost somebody, a loved one. But there's also then the like collective grief where sometimes we just feel so sad and we feel this sorrow, and we don't even know why, especially um, uh, all the empaths out there and all the young ones being born, they're just tapped into the collective energy. And I think that their their work of just all of our work of just like grieving, of wailing, of this crying, of all whatever the work is, and we can talk more about that, is really so important and such a like a sacred passage to the spiritual path. It really is like we need to
Yeah.
honor grief as our teacher, as the like this role of a teacher. Um, that really shows us it's like a pathway to our own joy. It's a pathway like it's a pathway to cracking open our heart, which is super important to
Mhm.
move through life
Right.
with an open heart. And those and like we've heard this metaphor before, but it like cracks open and allows that light to enter into the shadowy places. And so, grief,
Mhm.
I think, is that can be that catalyst. And
Yeah.
often we'll sit with like our shadows without doing grief work. We
Mhm.
kind of bypass or skip the heaviest feeling, which is, we really have to surrender to grief in order to feel it.
Yeah, such good points. Grief is the great heart opener,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um, the like it's like a I think dealing with loss is like a initiation events, you
Yeah.
know, that none of us ask for, but when it happens, it's so transformative that you're like not the same person that you were before you started it. And
Yeah.
we never choose those things. We never want it. For all we like go into the woods and do our vision quests and things like that. The real initiation events are usually something that we don't choose. They're just
Yeah.
things that happen, and a lot of them involve grief. And grief has long been part of the path of the initiate. And my theory on this is that grief and suffering in general really are what open us to compassion for
Hmm.
everyone else. Like
Hmm.
when we allow ourselves to grieve and to experience suffering of all kinds, then we feel it sort of softens us, or there's the potential that it can soften us in such ways we make really um, to feeling deep compassion for other humans who are grieving. It's like the common denominator that we all have, one of them.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think it's so spiritual. It's so sacred.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so funny. I was literally just thinking that when you said that. It's like it connects us. It's the connection to others. We grieve
Yeah,
because we are all connected, and it's like, and ultimately it's the connection that we all have to the divine, right? But it's the connection that we have. It's to humanity. We grieve because we're in this all together. And it serves, of course, I feel like grief serves as a mirror, and it's like reflecting the depth of our love, not only for and how much we care for ourselves but also others. um
yeah,
and I think that there's this like really powerful alchemy that happens when we do grieve, that sorrow there, or that like heaviness that we feel when we're feeling grief, that we kind of tend to bypass, that we tend to try and like
mm,
let's just like let's just overcome, we'll just go around this grief and it'll go away. It's like it's actually, it like purifies the heart. It like feels like on the other side of that is this, like you were saying, that the
yeah,
transmutation, and on the other side, I mean, of course there's like you learn from it, there's wisdom and there's the compassion, but I think there's honestly just joy and happiness on the other side. I really believe
yeah,
that.
totally. I think that's 100% true. And um we just get all jammed up when we don't process it. So
Yeah.
unprocessed grief blocks the heart, and
Yeah.
it because we don't really know how to process it very well. I think um it gets all jammed up in there. So let's talk about that. How do we, or how should we, how can we process grief?
Um, s- I feel like this is like the hard question, right? And it can be really individual, although I think safety is the key. We need to feel safe to grieve. And especially for
Mm,
those of us who were shut down, like when we were kids and we were told not to cry or we were told not to feel,
hmm.
then we have to get
Yep.
over that place of judgment for having our feelings. And so, you know, closing ourselves into our bedrooms and making sure that nobody can hear us can actually, like, we might actually need that, where nobody
Yeah,
can hear us, nobody's judging us, and that can be a necessary first step.
that's cool.
And finding that safe place and space so that we can
Mm,
make noise and wail and cry. And I love your
mm,
like anger workouts that actually
yeah,
open up the grief, the floodgates.
yeah.
You can talk more about that,
Hmm.
but I think that the space is really important.
That's so important. I love that. And I think crying is such an important cure for grief,
Yeah.
and they say like crying actually changes your neurochemistry,
Mm-hmm.
changes, like they've like done these studies of analyzing tears, and tears of rage, tears of grief, tears of joy.
Mm,
They have
mm,
different chemical content.
mm.
And it shifts your neurochemistry. So it shifts your brain chemistry to cry. And like you said, like we're often punished or teased for crying. So um, crying, I think, is sort of number one for me, like cure for grief.
Yeah.
I think breathing, super, 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 super important. Um, and breath work is an amazing. Um, and the first time I did breath work was like, I don't know, 20 years ago. My friend was going through a breath work training, and she's like, I have to do this many, free sessions and kind of practice on you. And I was like, yeah, sure, like we'll try it. So she had me breathing in this pattern, um, sort of a standard breathwork pattern. And I was feeling fine, but like 2 minutes into it, I was like, oh, oh, what? Like, I'd be crying like you do when you're a little kid. And I had no idea where it came from. Like it seemed like it just came out of nowhere. And um, who knows? I mean, it came and went, and I felt so much lighter afterwards. So breathing to me, crying, if I feel like it needs an expression, that's out of your body, like so
Yeah.
it's sort of energy moving up and through and out, and then kind of see where that goes. And I feel like also to have the expectation that it comes in waves.
Yeah.
So, especially when you've had a loss, um, you never know when that wave's going to hit you. And then it sort of like moves, for me, it like moves through my body like this wave of energy. And when
Yeah.
that's happening, breathing, crying, journaling, tapping, all the, you know, things that I do to process my emotions, and then it's gone for a minute or for a while until the next wave,
Hmm.
comes through. And so it's not a one and done
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, it's such a cycle. It really is.
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
and I'll add to that, like, crying, number one. We have to cry. And so, like the wailing, that feeling, whether it is like screaming, but also I'll do toning, like that
Yeah.
deep, like moaning almost, for me is really, really important. And it moves a lot of energy out. And I think that, you know,
Yeah.
wherever wherever the grief is locked up, and it could be in so many different parts of the body. For me, in the throat, was a big one. And so that was really helpful, is really helpful. And to the breath work is so great. And then I'll also add that, yoga, I've taught classes, I've been in classes where there'll be spontaneous crying. We'll
Yeah.
be working on hips. Often it's with some sort of hip, pose, hip opener, and because we store a lot of grief and emotions in our hips, and they'll be just spontaneous, like crying. And I'm always like, have this like smile and compassion, and just gratitude, like, it's working. It's like the yoga is unlocking the stuff. And so I'm always really grateful for that for the person, but it can be scary. And especially if you have no
Mm.
idea, like, why am I crying in yoga class? Um, but it is
I
that
always
movement,
cry in
somatic.
yoga class. I always cry in yoga class. And it's just kind of hard. Like I'd be really happy and comfortable crying in your yoga class, which I probably have done and already. And but crying in, like, what do you do if you're in gym yoga and you're crying, or you're in
Right?
a yoga class where they're like, what? They're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
expecting that to happen, right?
It's like, uns, uns, uns. And there's all the like
Yeah, exactly.
fast flow, tears.
Yeah.
Great. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so the somatic movement, is so important, and seeing a somatic therapist, I think, can be really, really powerful. There's a lot more somatic therapists now, that
Yeah.
can help with that. But yeah, the breath work. And I think it's really important to say that we can have we can take really great care of our physical body. We can eat really well. We can drink enough water. We can even have like good energy management. We can work out all the time and completely bypass our grief, you
Yes.
know? And
So easy to bypass it.
yeah. And so
Or
it
we put
really,
that time limit. Like you can be sad for that 6 week period and then you
yeah,
better be over it, you
right.
know?
Yes. But
Mm,
we can, I, w- I think about like when my grandma passed, it was 2019, and it was like 3 years later, and I'm still like, bawling my eyes out. And so it's
yeah.
really important to not judge our grief.
Yeah.
Um, and again, to not like we don't know where it's coming from. It might be the state of the world, and we're just feeling it. So allowing ourselves to feel.
I was thinking too, like there's certain people, some people have a really hard time accessing their grief. Like they
Yes.
know they should feel sad and they just can't get there.
Right.
And I think, that's like all the layers of programming or all
Yeah.
the, different kind of armoring that we can have as humans, depending on how things were in your family when you were growing up and all so many different factors.
Yeah.
But I was thinking like music and movies are two things that I think people, like if you want to cry, just listen to some country music. Like probably you have like a sad playlist, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Music to make you cry.
Yes.
And same thing with movies. Like there's certain, and I think this is why people like movies that bring a tear, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what, we could all think of a few that if you need to cry, this is the movie that you watch, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And if you can't quite get there on your own, you need to cry, maybe that's kind of like a little lubrication,
Yeah.
to kind of get the motor going on the crying. Um and I feel like what happens is those things are so cathartic, and once you start crying or once the grief opens for one thing, it tends to open for all the things,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like the floodgate, which we don't want to be scared of. But yeah, the
yeah,
movies and the music. And it's true, a lot of people are in avoidance mode for so long, that, it's either just not even in our um field to turn towards the grief, or there's complete avoidance either way. Um, and so once we accept that and embrace that grief is really our ally, right? Um,
yeah.
that whether we um, ask around for a sad movie or we know about sad movies, I remember I've my sister and I would like you have if you need a good cry, watch this movie, And I can think about times, like those sad playlists are so important. And you could be in your car. That's a great place to cry,
Yeah,
listening to sad music. Um, and there's books, of course. I think it's, and like I was saying, the anger workouts, allowing yourself 5 minutes, setting a timer,
mm,
taking the plastic bat, and you're starting, it's not at the beginning, it's actually about anger. But,
yeah.
you know, whether it's anger's at the top, grief is always below it. Whether there's grief at the
Or
top,
yes,
anger's always
angers.
below it.
It's totally right.
They totally
Depending
come
on
hand.
which one we have more access to, like which
That's
one's on
it.
the top, and that will depend on our family too. But yeah,
Yes.
that's totally, it's like totally true. Like that they come together, grief and hurt, anger and grief and hurt. Underneath anger, there's always the hurt and grief.
Yeah.
And it's so funny, like in my family when I was growing up, um, nobody was allowed to get angry,
Yeah.
but grief was allowed. So everybody in my family cries when they're angry,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
That's this
Yeah,
exactly the same as our family. Yeah.
yeah,
Like being angry was a four-letter word. It's not allowed. But
right.
you could cry. You could cry all you wanted. And
Yeah.
so,
And I think there are families where it's opposite. Everybody was angry all the time, but
right.
nobody was allowed to cry. And then, um, then they're the angry grievers. So when they're grieving, they're picking fights and,
That's
getting mad and going into
yeah.
road rage and stuff. Yeah.
Right. And it's just grief. It's grief coming out sideways. It's
Yeah.
that jelly donut. And so, you know, there's these
My,
this is
my jelly donut theory of emotional regulation.
it's so good. It's
It's
just it's real.
you squeeze the donuts. We were talking about this in our mystery school class the
Yeah.
other day, where my theory is you squeeze the jelly donut, the jelly's coming out somewhere.
It's gonna come
And
out
that's
sideways. It's not gonna
gonna
it's
come out
gotta come
sideways.
out somewhere. It's not gonna look pretty.
Nope.
And that's going back to like the grief is your teacher. The grief is this gateway to yourself. And so if you're just, you know,
Mm,
and if you're somebody who grief is actually rage, then it's the rage that is the grief, and that's your teacher. And to be
yeah,
like, oh, I'm having road rage. I actually just need to sit with my feelings. What's below that rage?
yeah,
And then vice versa, I need to sit with my grief and feel it, and what is underneath that might be like rage, you know.
yeah. And I
So,
think of these two things, those two experiences, grief and rage, are the two emotions that get the spiritual bypass more than any other. Do you
more
know what I
than
mean? Like
anything else.
they
Yeah.
they just or just the spiritual people are gonna bypass the discomfort of that. Like
Yeah.
somehow, like if we can transcend those things and not actually have to feel them, um they don't you think that happens like so often?
So often. It's no judgment, but I'm just gonna say it's like the love and lighters, who everything's
Mhm.
fine, everything is love, everything is light. Underneath that, or it's in the same breath they're turning around and like screaming at their dog, or they're the
Right.
road ragers, or they're like whatever it is.
They're the
And so
they're the jelly donuters.
they're the jelly donut. And so
Yeah.
you can't love and light your way through the spiritual path. We've probably said this before, but it's worth, saying again. It's like any bypassing of our feelings. But and grief and rage are like kind of the biggies, right?
Yeah,
They're what's under the all of it.
totally. And I,
Yeah.
I mean, I get the impulse to want to bypass it because in the moment it doesn't feel very good, or we're afraid. I think sometimes we're more afraid of what it's going to feel like than what it actually feels like.
Yeah.
That it's the fear of it, um, the fear of flooding. Like once I start crying, I'm never going to stop. I've heard so many people say that.
Yes.
So they hold back everything, and that's flooding doesn't feel very good. So
Right.
I think I get it why people sort of don't want to open that door, but when we process it little by little, especially if you're dealing with really intense loss, really intense trauma,
Yeah.
um, little by little, and understanding that it comes in waves, and if we just show up and be present for it,
Yeah.
for me, the like holding my own hand through it and like, okay, here comes a wave. We're gonna be okay. We're okay. I'm
Yeah.
okay. It'll pass. Sort of like, you know, surrendering to it, relaxing into it, letting it pass. It's so much easier than if you fight it, resist it, push it away. Um, and this is kind of a gross analogy, but it reminds me of like when you have to throw up, you
Yeah.
know, and there's sort of
Like,
a
no,
surrender
no, no.
factor. You're like,
Yeah.
no, no, no. And you can push it away, push it away, push it away. And then you're miserable. Or you can just sort of lean into it and surrender to it. And it's never as bad as you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
That's over.
and you feel so much better when it's over like that. And then I think like, for me, like, I know I'm going to be okay. I know I'm going to feel better. when I'm done with my crying jag or my, the momentary catharsis. So I'm not afraid of it anymore. I think we have to kind of
Yeah.
get over that fear of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and
Yeah.
when you really go, this is the below, right? And is like, what are people really afraid of? And it brings grief brings us back when we keep doing the grief work, it brings us back to our core wound, which is, this
Mm,
cycle of life and death. And so really under it
yeah.
all, it's this like facing our own mortality, which some of us are afraid of, some of us aren't. I personally have never been afraid of death, but I think, that grieving, that loss of actually being here and being separate from source is like
Yeah.
unbearably sad.
Yeah.
And so there's like all what we're ultimately grieving is like, leaving our loved ones is when we die, or having them leave us, or I mean it's just so it's quite it is big. It's like these are big
Mm,
things. And this is
yeah.
why we're here, because it is all about, I mean, everything. Like you said at the very beginning of this podcast, it's the cycle of life. It's the cycle of life and
Yeah.
death that brings us really closer to the mysteries of existence, which is the spiritual path.
Absolutely. I so love that you brought that up. And that, I think we have to hold as humans on the planet these conflicting realities like we so often do.
Yeah.
On one hand, the love is eternal. There's no such thing as separation.
Yeah.
Separation is an illusion, right?
Yeah.
And we're all love never goes anywhere. The sort of the eternal nature of love. That's one reality. And the other
Yeah.
reality is when somebody dies, we are separate from them,
Yeah.
or when if we get a divorce or if we, you know, uh, we lose people. We in this human life experience that loss. It's real, you know.
Yeah.
So both things are true at the same time, and that's
Yeah.
where I think if we just go with love is eternal, and there's no and separation's an illusion, that's when we're in the spiritual bypass.
That's it.
That's, you know, and if we're only in this grief, and we forget about the eternal nature of love, we kind of like can disappear into this swamp, never-ending swamp of grief,
Yeah.
where there's no ending point for it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's hard to hold both those things as simultaneously true,
Yeah, really hard.
right?
And it's like, yes, we've lost somebody on the physical realm, and it's really trusting and accepting and being able to feel them still in a different realm, in a different dimension, in different wherever they are, to still feel them,
Mm,
and to trust that also exists. Whatever our beliefs are, there's, I think, um well, I'm not going to get into religious beliefs. That's a whole different topic about the afterlife.
what happens when you die? We'll talk about that some other time. It's a really good one though.
I just had to catch myself. I'm like, that's a different topic. But um, but it's true. It's holding when we're here in these human bodies in this physical form. But it is both are true. And how do we hold that? You know?
Tricky,
And
tricky.
it's tricky. It's hard. And we
Yeah.
can. We are actually
Mm,
designed to be able to hold both of those. And
yeah.
ultimately I believe death is just this construct that humans have created because we can't see with our own eyeballs that, you know, the change has happened, that the where the what the change is, whatever the
Right.
change of death has brought us. But it's the same with birth. We've more accepted birth, but we haven't
Right.
quite accepted death. And so, the grief work
Mm.
is like that loss, whatever the loss is. There's a lot of loss
So
in life.
totally. And because it's moving forward, we live in in time. We live in a temporal universe, temporal world. So
Yep.
time is going on. And that means things change. The other thing I wanted to bring in here as a point of conversation is how do we show up for other people who are grieving?
Mm.
Because there's room for improvement, I
Totally.
think. And there's something more than I'm sorry for your loss,
Yeah.
or which is it's a fine thing to say, I guess. And not it's not a bad start. It's kind of what's acceptable
Yeah.
when we're dealing with loss. We're trying to show up. What I notice is that it's very hard for most people to really stay present in the face of other people's loss.
Yeah.
And I really noticed this when I had a friend when I was a young mother, and I was having babies, and I had a friend whose baby died,
Mm.
and um, and was so, you know, it was so everybody left, like just left, like nobody could deal with it.
Yeah.
None of the other moms could deal with it. There were so few people that just showed up for her and her family because my sense of this was the thought that that could happen sort of popped the illusion of safety that we all had,
Yeah.
or popped like,
Mm.
oh my God, if I have to look at that happen to that family, I have to deal with the fact that it happened to me. We're just a hair's breadth away from that reality, kind of any moment by moment, right?
Yeah.
And I felt so bad. Not only was she dealing with this incredible loss, but it was this family really had to do it alone because nobody
Mm.
else would show. People just wouldn't show up.
Mm.
So how do we show up in the face of other people's grief?
Mm. Yeah. Well, in my experience and living in a community that is pretty incredible and will, and so I've learned different ways. And I've learned, I feel like my mother is actually, it's one of her strong suits is she's really good at being there for people when bad shit happens.
Mm.
Hard stuff happens. Um, and so, I have to turn towards like one, in my own experience, what would feel good? And then what have I seen other people do that seems to help? And I think that, bringing just physically being there in a regulated nervous system
Yeah,
and sitting with somebody and holding their hand and not even saying anything, because what do
right,
you really say? Because
right.
everybody is going to receive the words differently or they might not hear you. It depends on like the stage that they're in of that loss. But I feel like that's one of the best things that we can do is to physically
Agreed.
be there
Just show
sitting,
up.
just show up with a regulated nervous system, not feeding into the thing, not adding to a story, not not even really commiserating. I mean, it's just I'm just going to be here with you and I'm going to listen. I think that's
Mm,
one thing that is very helpful. Um, and then to take that a step further, I think in community, showing up and bringing like just bringing food or bringing
yeah,
resources um, is, even if you just drop them on the doorstep, I
yeah,
think it just feels good. You feel supported, right? Because it's about support.
yeah.
I can't support
Sure.
myself right now. And so other people are here supporting me.
So it's so good. I think like it's just showing up and doing the dishes or throwing a load of laundry in, or
Yeah.
cleaning the house. I'm over tidying up a little bit, or
Yeah.
I love it that these days they have those like the meal trains, you can
Yeah.
sign up, get that
So
going on.
good.
That you just yeah, there's a lot there. Um and I think like I don't I know I don't have any no way to know how you feel. Like there's
Right.
no way I can know how you feel. So I think some of the worst things we can do is sort of trot out our own story. Oh, you think that's bad? You should hear what happened to me. you know,
Right.
like we don't want to trot out, we don't want to one up them or like mine is worse than yours or, and that
Right.
can feel like we're trying to connect or commiserate, commiserate. That just means bringing more misery. Like, let's create more misery together.
Oh my gosh, let's
Let's
not
not
do
do
that.
that. Let's not do
Such a
that.
good point.
Um, so I think those are important things. And just like, I'm not going to pretend I know what you feel like, but because I don't. And how could we if we've never been through that? And even if we have been through that, we might not feel the same way.
Right.
So I don't know how you feel. I'm not going to pretend to say I know how you feel. I'm just here for you. I'm here for you. And
Yeah.
bringing that presence and creating when they talk about holding space, like
Yeah.
really holding space for that person to, you talk about creating safety for feelings. Like, can we create, you know, I said, it's okay if you cry, like go
Mm.
ahead, um, because sometimes people need permission to do that. I'm sort of a big believer of not shoving tissues into somebody's hand when they're crying,
Mhm.
or shoving the tissue box at them, because I feel like when we do that, even though we're trying to be helpful, it sort of sends this underlying message of stop crying.
Yeah,
You
it's
know, I feel
mhm.
like if somebody shoves tissues at me, they're telling me to stop crying, even if they're not,
Right.
you
And
know.
it interrupts
Um,
it interrupts the process. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So just kind of like, let it all out, like
Mhm.
giving them that kind of permission to, it's okay if you cry. Um, or if you're mad, like all your feels, like it's okay. And we hold that as an okayness inside of ourselves that people feel,
Yeah.
even if we don't say it. But I think that verbal permission is such a beautiful gift, you know.
Mhm.
And then I've heard, I haven't had a significant loss in my life like that, but I've heard, if you say the person's name, if you
Mm.
talk about that person, if you say, do you want to talk about them? Like, what was your favorite thing about them? Like, where we don't, you know, um, yeah, this woman I know who lost her baby, the one I was telling you about,
Mhm.
like her husband's family came like 2 days after the baby died, and they just cleared out the baby's room. They just came, and it was like, um, and then everything was gone, like everything. And
Mm.
I feel like I'm sure they were coming from a good place of like, they felt like that was the right thing to do, but it left my friend in this no memories, no,
Mm.
no, like almost like she had to pretend it never happened,
As if it never
you
happened.
know?
Oof.
Yeah,
I feel that
right.
deep.
Uh,
Yeah, that's
yeah. And so, like, what if we don't do that? What if we create that space to share, what that person's life was like, to say their name, to, talk about them,
yeah.
to talk about what's great about them if you remember. So,
Yeah.
sharing a beloved memory and saying their name out, like, what I remember the most about so and so was this one time when we, that
Mhm.
kind of thing, I think is so much more helpful than I'm sorry for your loss.
Mhm. Yeah,
Like,
that's really good. Really good pointers.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because then, it also shifts it keeps them it's because it's memory, right? And it keeps the memory
Mm-hmm.
sort of alive in your it's like the is it the Dios de los Muertos? Totally said it wrong. But like the
Mm-hmm.
ofrenda, right, is like to have um to keep the memory alive as you speak of them and you have like pictures
Yeah.
of them and of our loved ones. And so I think that culturally, that's a really beautiful way of just keeping our hearts open in the face of grief. I think that's, you can just even feel it. Like when you think of somebody saying, oh, well, tell me a story about this person. It opens your heart
Mm-hmm.
right there. Just you feel yourself
Yeah.
like it doesn't take the grief away, but it like opens something. It opens the that space between you and them. So I think that's really, really beautiful and helpful.
Mm,
Yeah.
such a great conversation. Thanks for putting it on the table for our consideration.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
if we're all here to elevate our state of consciousness, all of these things are really important, and grief work is really important, and it's something that
Mm,
maybe isn't talked about enough in the spiritual community, um,
mm.
because of whatever reason. It's hard.
Right.
It's hard, and
It's
it's not
hard. We don't want to be a
glamorous.
downer. We don't want to be like the
Hmm.
downer that's bringing that energy to the party, but it's really important.
It's really important. It's the sacred ally on the spiritual path. So if
Yeah.
everybody can embrace their grief, then the world would look a little different.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Buddha. There was some, I forget which enlightened master it was.
Mm.
That was one of the Buddhists. Um, there was the laughing Buddha, the Hotai Buddha, but there was
Uh-huh.
also who reached enlightenment through laughing. There was
Yeah.
also the one that reached enlightenment through sorrow,
Yeah.
who just
Mm.
had so much loss that this one reached enlightenment through sorrow. So it's a legit path that I think
Yeah.
more of us walk that one
Yeah.
than any other. Probably the most walked path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Mm,
Yeah. Interesting.
mm.
Good stuff.
Well, thanks for joining us in this conversation. I'm so glad that you are all here, and drop us a line in the comments. Let us know what you think,
Yeah.
and we'll be back again soon.
Great. See you next time. Thank you.